Good evening, everybody. Lovely to see you all. My name is Matthias Lesser. I'm the director of the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights Policy, and it is a genuine joy welcoming back one of our long-standing friends here at the Carr Center. The most important thing to say about him is that he is a senior fellow at the Carr Center, and then he has side jobs in other parts of the world. So it's not joking. Of course, Roberto Barroso is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Brazil, as you will all know, and has also been long affiliated with us and has been a long-standing friend of everything around Howard Square. We are delighted to have him here today to give a talk on something that is of much important current relevance. So the topic of the talk is democracy, populism, and institutional resistance, Supreme Courts in the game of power. And definitely the Supreme Courts, both in Brazil and in the United States, very much have been in the game of power. So let me just remind you of a few things here in the background, and also as a way of highlighting how incredibly important and really urgent comparisons between these two countries are. So as most of you will know the American story better. So in the United States, we had January 6, 2021, when many hundreds of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol because they were unwilling to accept the defeat in the election of 2020, on the day when the victory of Joe Biden in this contest was supposed to be certified. So that was January 6, 2021 in the United States. As a result of that, one of the, I think even the biggest legal action in the United States was brought against many hundreds of them. And in the course of the years, they were identified and found guilty. Many of them were sent to prison or fined, barred from going to Washington, D.C. All of these people, basically in an executive order, were pardoned as President Trump returned to office a couple of weeks ago. In the meantime, the courts have also, the Supreme Court in the United States has become quite active around issues of presidential immunity. And so President Trump is now coming back to office basically with a broad understanding of immunity for anything that he would do in office, where what counts as being done in office is simply not specified. So it's basically up for presidential interpretation as well. So basically, the way the United States Supreme Court got into the power game here is by creating a situation where the president very much has a free hand in doing whatever he likes. In Brazil, the story went quite a different way. So in Brazil, they had January 8, 2023, where something quite similar happened, where supporters of Jair Bolsonaro were storming various governmental buildings in the capital of Brasilia. And as a result of that, the Supreme Court got involved in the game of power in very different ways. Namely, well, it wasn't so much in the first instance the Supreme Court, but the Superior Electoral Court, which in Brazil, like in many South American countries, is a different entity. Right? So elections are also run by courts, but they're different courts. So the Superior Electoral Court, of which Luís Roberto Barroso is also the Chief Justice, bought Jair Bolsonaro from running for office until 2030. And a couple of months ago, actually, the federal police in Brazil also filed charges on criminal grounds against Bolsonaro. So the courts have acted, the Supreme Courts have acted really differently in this game of power in the United States and Brazil. So very much a current events topic, also not an entirely untrivial one to engage with, given that in the United States, in the Justice Department, senior people who have been involved in the investigations against Donald Trump have been fired. And the Justice Department is also investigating possibilities of going after prosecutors at the local level who have prosecuted those people who stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So I'm saying all of this also by way of explaining we are going to be recording this event. So we want to share news and information and knowledge about all these things. But then later, as you ask your question, it is always nice to identify yourself by name, but we're not insisting that you do, because again, this is on the record, and this is not an entirely trivial matter to be on the record on these days. With all that said, so just a couple of things about Justice Barroso. So he, after a distinguished career both in the private sector and in the professorial domain, he joined the Supreme Court of Brazil in 2013 and became the Chief Justice in 2023. So really only a few months after these events of January 8th in Brasilia. And in fact, on the day when he was inaugurated in September 2023, all sorts of barriers were still around the buildings in the capital, so there were still visible traces of the events of January 2023. And since then, you will have followed this a little bit. The court in Brazil has in fact been very active, engaging any number of issues and major players in this domain around misinformation, disinformation, and it is sometimes another justice in the Supreme Court of Brazil who is in the news about this internationally. But of course, everything that comes from the Supreme Court of Brazil is very much happening under leadership of its Chief Justice. So in that spirit, please join me in welcoming Luís Roberto Barroso, who will be talking to us about democracy, populism, and institutional resistance, Supreme Courts in the game of power. Welcome back.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very, very happy, delighted to be here once again and share some ideas and some thoughts on this subject: democracy, populism, and institutional resistance, and what's the role of courts in this political game. I want to thank my very good friend, Matthias Luís, for always welcoming me here at the Carr-Ryan Center and at the Roberto School, and for being in, he was in Brazil during my swearing in at the court, which was a great pleasure. So I'm happy to be here. I have divided this presentation in three basic parts. First one, I called revisiting the main concepts important here, which are democracy, populism, and the role of courts. Then our second chapter will be what's happening in the world with authoritarian populism and its rise in the current moment. And the third and last part is democratic resistance. And then I'm going to tell some success stories and some defeats of the court when clashing with authoritarian populism. So I start with the basics on democracy. Constitutional democracy was the winning ideology of the 20th century, having prevailed over all the alternatives that appeared, which were communism, fascism, Nazism, military regimes, and religious fundamentalisms. Constitutional democracy is a concept that contains two sides of the same coin. One side, we are talking about popular sovereignty, free and fair elections, and the rule of the majority. And on the other side, we are talking about limited power, rule of the law, and protection of fundamental rights. Most constitutional democracies around the world have in their institutional arrangement a Supreme Court that has as one of its roles to arbitrate the tensions that appear between the two sides of the coin, between the will of the majority on one side and the protection of the rule of the law and of fundamental rights on the other side. And the last thing I want to add on these basic ideas of democracy is that contemporary democracies are made of votes, rights, and reasons. And this means that they're not limited to the electoral process, to the electoral moment, but they also imply the respect for the fundamental rights of all and for a permanent public debate that legitimizes political decisions. Now we move on to our second concept we're going to be working here, which is authoritarian populism. And here I want to say that the world is witnessing a wave, I think I could say, an authoritarian, anti-pluralist, and anti-institutional wave that poses serious risks to democracies. In most cases, authoritarian populism bears the mark of personalistic and charismatic leaders that manipulate the fears, the needs, and the desires of the population, often promising simple solutions, simple and mistaken solutions for complex problems. Populism can be right-wing or left-wing, as history has proved, but these days, the main risks have come from far-right populism. The hallmark of right-wing populism is the division of society into us and them. Us, the pure, decent, conservative people, and them, the cosmopolitan, corrupt, and liberal elites. There are several causes for this phenomenon, and we're going to be talking about them in a minute. Authoritarian populism deploys the same strategies in different parts of the world, which are a direct communication with their supporters, more recently using social media. Second place, the bypass or the co-opting of intermediary institutions that have the role to make this interface between the people and the government, like the press, like the legislature, like civil society organizations, and usually authoritarian populism elects as one of their main enemies the Supreme Courts that have the role of limiting the power of the majority. And in most parts, they also deploy a tool, which is the use of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, or conspiracy theories. And this use of social media for disseminating misinformation and disinformation has been a pattern in different parts of the world, which includes Brazil, includes India, includes the UK. So this is what I wanted to say as a basic idea on authoritarian populism. And our third concept here is Supreme Courts and the role of Supreme Courts. Most democracies in the world reserve part of power to be exercised by public agents that are not elected, that are selected due to technical competence and due to their impartiality. In most countries, or in many countries, at the top of the judiciary, there is a Supreme Court, like in Brazil, like in India, like in UK, like in Canada, that is at the top of the judiciary. In Europe, in most countries, they have a slightly different format of constitutional courts rather than Supreme Courts. But despite this, these difference in the format, as I said, they have the same missions. Constitutional courts and Supreme Courts have, I would say, three basic missions. The first one is to ensure the majority rule, to ensure that the rules of the game are complied with and the majority can govern, assuring free and fair elections, and I should say refraining from interfering with the decisions of the elected branches, except when they clearly violate the Constitution. So this is the first mission, is to ensure the rule of the majority. The second mission is to preserve democracy, preserve, as I said, the rules of the game, preventing majorities from abusing their power by changing the rules to their own benefit or to perpetuate themselves in power. And the third mission of a Supreme Court is to protect fundamental rights of everyone, including the minorities. So there's no need to say that everywhere there is a certain level of tension between populist governments and Supreme Courts or constitutional courts. Because the Constitution has as its main role to limit the power of the majorities. Supreme Courts interpret the Constitution, and populists overvalue the power of majorities. So that's the main reason of the tension between populist governments and Supreme Courts more generally. So we now move on to the second part of our conversation, which is what's happening in the world. I just said that constitutional democracy was the winning ideology of the 20th century. However, something seems to have gone wrong more recently in different parts of the world in a scenario that has been nicknamed democratic recession, democratic backsliding, abusive constitutionalism, competitive authoritarianism, illiberal democracy, or autocratic legalism, among other derogatory terms. And these expressions have been used to identify political processes that occurred in countries like Hungary, like Poland, like Turkey, like Russia, like the Philippines, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua. So in different parts of the world, this process of democratic recession has been present. And as Levitsky and Ziblatt have clearly stated, what is different now is that the erosion of democracy does not come with coup d'etat led by generals and their subordinates, but by elected political leaders, prime ministers, and presidents that once in power, measure by measure, progressively start to deconstruct the pillars of democracy. And this has happened even in consolidated democracies throughout the world. And we see this advance of authoritarian populism in countries like France, in countries like the UK, in countries like Germany at this moment. There are several causes for this advance of authoritarian populism, and I want to investigate some of them in our conversation here. But I would like to say at the outset that they are also linked to the dysfunctions of democracy. Democracy in many parts of the world has failed to deliver its promises of prosperity and equal opportunities for everyone. And authoritarian populism flows through these failures of democracy. Democracy, a good definition is it's a project of collective self-government. So whoever feels excluded, the groups that feel excluded from the benefits of democracy don't feel, of course, committed to preserving it. And I think this has been the case in many parts of the world. And I think the causes can be classified. I usually classify everything in three categories. That's a superstition that I have, and it's been working so far. So my three categories are: there are political reasons, there are socioeconomic reasons, and there are cultural identity reasons. I'm going to briefly go through them. The political causes of the rise of authoritarian populism start, in my view, with the deficit of representativeness in electoral systems. People don't feel like they have relevance and voice in the electoral system these days. I travel a lot for academic reasons. No matter where you go, no one is satisfied with their electoral system. So democracy is not delivering enough satisfaction in what representation of the people is concerned. Second political cause is the negative perception of politics, the belief that politics revolves more around the interests of politicians themselves than the interests of society. And the third reason is appropriation of the state by extractive elites. And I use this expression in the sense that Darwin Asimov and James Robinson have used it in their book, Why Nations Fail, elites that put the states at the service of their own interests when, at the best, when they're not just outright, when there's not just outright corruption. So all these factors that I just mentioned have led to a certain distrust in the institutions. The second set of causes, the socio-economic causes, include persistent poverty within countries and among countries throughout the world. And second, the relative increase in inequality. And the third reason is a social stagnation, a difficulty in upward mobility. And I should say that globalization and the knowledge economy have negatively impacted many segments of the society in different parts of the world. And the impressive rise of artificial intelligence will impact even farther the socio-economic conditions of the world more generally. And finally, there are cultural reasons for this rise of authoritarian populism. And these causes are identity politics enabled the progress in rights of women, Afro-descendants, LGBT communities, indigenous communities, people with disabilities, and these advances diminished the power of traditional hegemonic sectors. That's one first reason, and then this is a reason it seems very clear to me in this country. The second cultural identity cause is the emergence of stark divisions in societies, such as between regions, between urban and rural populations, between religious and non-religious individuals, and between globalists and nationalists. So societies these days are very divided. There is a main cleavage between different visions of the world for different reasons, geographical, ideological, and other reasons. And the third cultural cause I would identify is the search for scapegoats for major problems like crimes, like unemployment, like cultural transformations. And then these scapegoats can include immigrants, can include gays, can include leftists or Jews or any other social groups. One feature of authoritarian populism is the need to have enemies and to have some social group to blame. As I just saw more recently, the blame now is diversity. Diversity is the cause of accidents. So, and truth is, Democrats have not, in a totally successful fashion, been able to convince the totality of society, I would say, that recognizing rights to women, African descendants, gays, indigenous communities, or people with disabilities are not progressive causes. Dignity and equality of all people are the causes of humanity. It's not causes of one group or one vision of the world. That's the cause for everyone. But we have not been able to convince people of that. So in authoritarian populist regimes, there is an inevitable clash between the regime, authoritarian and populist, and Supreme Courts. Because, as I said before, populist governments are hostile to Supreme Courts because they have the mission of limiting the power of the majorities. And populists, as I said before, overvalue the power of majorities. And populist leaders, consequently, attempt to weaken and capture courts. And they deploy different strategies in order to do that. I'm going to mention here, once again, 3 of these strategies. The first one is packing the courts with submissive judges, forcing the opening of vacancies with changes in retirement rules or increasing the number of seats. That's a playbook. Secondly, suppressing powers through constitutional amendments, depriving constitutional courts or Supreme Courts of part of their powers, especially what happened in certain countries, to exercise judicial review over constitutional amendments. And finally, as it happened in Brazil and in Venezuela, the threats of impeachment of Supreme Court justices before the legislatures. So these strategies try to capture the court, to fill the courts with submissive judges, and find in the courts a tool for legitimizing many authoritarian measures. So the attempt to capture the court is to steal this moral authority of the judiciary, legitimizing many of the authoritarian measures, as has happened, for example, very typically in Venezuela, where a clearly fraudulent election was validated by the courts. Some consequences of authoritarian populism. It's the last topic in the second chapter. We move to our final chapter. Some consequences of authoritarian populism are very grave and very serious. Some of them are moral consequences. The first I want to mention is the loss of civility. This necessity of disqualifying morally disqualifying whoever disagrees with the authoritarian populist leader. To disqualify the opponent is a permanent strategy in a world in which being civil means treating everyone with respect, with concern, despite people having a different view of the world, which of course is legitimate. The second consequence that we are watching is this global articulation of a far right, of an extremist view of the world, capturing the conservative camp. Democracy has room for different views of the world, for liberals, for progressive, for conservatives. The problem with extremism is not a political view. It's the intolerance regarding the other. it's the non-acceptance of the other. Because from intolerance to violence, the step is very short. So this capture of the conservative camp by an extremist vision is one of the consequences, I would add, of authoritarian populism. A third one that is very clear in many parts of the world is the political manipulation of people's religiosity. In many parts of the world, authoritarian populism captures religious leaders to advance their purposes, and the rhetoric includes my opponents or who thinks different than I do are not Christians, they do not defend the family, or they are here serving the demon, or any other derogatory way to refer to people that think different. And here, there is one phenomenon, I think that it started here in America, but it kind of spread it throughout the world, is the combination of an ultra-liberal economic view. And when I say liberal, it's not in the sense that it's used more commonly here in the United States. When in the whole world, except here, when you say liberal, you mean someone that's pro-free business, pro-business more generally. So this combination of a radical pro-business view of the world, which is an economic view, with a cultural view that's very conservative against women's rights, against gays' rights, against indigenous communities. So there's this strange combination of an economic view, very, very pro-business, so pro-freedom of enterprise, and on the other hand, very conservative, very anti-liberal in what concerns minorities and cultural issues. Fourth consequence that I want to highlight here is the loss of the importance of truth with the constant use of social media to spread disinformation, misinformation, deliberate lies, and conspiracy theories. And here, it's not only a political consideration, but an ethical consideration that will remit us to Kant. Lying is not a decent way of living life. So one sentence that I like is, we need to make lying wrong again. Lying cannot be a legitimate strategy in life generally and in politics. And it has become this strategy based on the assumption that I've seen and I've heard and I've spoken to people, since everything is dominated by the left, by the communists, by the liberal, I can be as harsh as I can in the deconstruction of this order because they took over and we need to put it down. And finally, as we all can notice, there is this major disregard for knowledge institutions. This disdain is evident in the attacks on the press, universities, think tanks, and intellectuals in general. And you can see this as another topic of the playbook of populism. They don't like journalists, they don't like universities, they don't like intellectuals, they don't like people that think and see what's actually going on. So these are the main consequences I would like to share here. And here we get to our final part, the democratic resistance, and where courts were able to prevail in countries where they were clearly defeated. One clear defeat of a court of justice, of a Supreme Court, of a constitutional court, was Hungary. After the rise of the Fidesz party and the arrival of Viktor Orbán in power, in Hungary, the court that was very powerful and very independent was totally captured, as our friend, mine and Nancy's friend here, happy to have you here, Kian Chappell, has extensively written about it, what happened in Hungary, that a powerful court was totally captured by this progressive authoritarian wave that over time increased the number of judges, reduced the retirement age to open new vacancies, changed the criteria for the appointment of judges, removed powers of judicial review, and in 2013, the government had total control of the court and of other institutions like the press, like the university, like civil society organizations. So Hungary is the paradigmatic case of a court that was defeated by authoritarian populism. So the same thing happened in Latin America with Venezuela. Hugo Chavez arrived into power in 1999 and stayed with successive re-elections until 2013. In 2002, he suffered an attempted coup d'etat, was able to return to power. And when the Supreme Court did not punish the generals that led the coup, he was very tough on the court, increased the number of judges, and facilitated the removal of judges by Congress. And more than that, the Supreme Court in Venezuela was not only captured, but it became an auxiliary line of the dictatorship that transformed this wonderful country that is Venezuela in a humanitarian disaster. It's very sad. Sometimes I see the discussion if it's a left-wing dictatorship or a right-wing dictatorship. It doesn't make any difference. It's just a humanitarian disaster, what's going on in Venezuela. And finally, the third case I want to mention here was Russia. In 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Constitutional Court of Russia rose as a very important actor in the redemocratization of Russia. But then in 1993, it clashed with Boris Yeltsin over decrees suspending the parliament. The court understood, I think correctly, that he had exceeded his powers. Yeltsin then called a popular referendum and won support to dissolve both the parliament and the court. And when the Constitutional Court was reinstated in 1995, it had a much smaller role, and it was already submissive to the new president then and now, who was Vladimir Putin. Similar stories have happened in many other countries, including Turkey, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. A successful story, though, occurred in Colombia. Even before the authoritarian populism wave in 2010, the Constitutional Court of Colombia issued a very important decision. The president, Álvaro Uribe, was elected, and then he passed in Congress a constitutional amendment allowing him to run for a second term. He ran for a second term and he won. And then he obtained from Congress a third constitutional amendment to let him run for a third time. And then the Constitutional Court of Colombia struck down this new amendment by saying, which was not by saying, it was implicit, a third term in Latin America means the path to dictatorship. But what they actually said was the third term is a change in the identity of the Constitution. So they're not observing the proper procedure because they could only review constitutional amendments if it didn't follow the proper procedure. And so they said, this amendment is a new constitution. And this is not the procedure to enact a new constitution, struck down the amendment, and that saved Colombia. Colombia is a wonderful country, also has many problems, but it's never been a dictatorship. And I think due to the constitutional course. Here in the United States, in the previous election in 2020, also there was several challenges before courts, and 2 or 3 cases reached the Supreme Court, and the judicial system did not interfere, did not void elections in any states. Of course, things unfolded in the way we all know, but that's part of democracy. Democracy doesn't mean that the way we prefer always prevail, but actually the courts did not interfere with the electoral process at the time. And then finally, we have Poland. Poland is one of the rare cases in which a country that had fallen in authoritarian populism was able to get rid of it through an electoral process with the elections that kicked out the Law and Order Party. However, as our Ken Chabel recently wrote and published a piece on the New York Times, the institutions were so contaminated by authoritarian populism, and the court was so much captured by authoritarian populism that the democratic government is not making much progress in dismantling what it inherited, and it's not doing well in the surveys, and there is a risk that authoritarian populism could return to power. There is also a case, history is still unfolding, but in Israel, there was an attempt to curb the power of the court, and the court resisted, decided voiding the new legislation. And I think this is a game that's still going on from my perspective. Of course, the war kind of blurs our capacity to understand what's going to happen in this area. And finally, Brazil, a few words on Brazil. In 2016, after 14 years in power, the Workers' Party was defeated, first through a very controversial impeachment that kicked out of office President Dilma Rousseff, and in 2018, a new election took place, and a very conservative populist regime started. And now, since we're talking about Brazil, and let me say, I am an institutional actor, I'm not a political actor. My role is to interpret the Constitution, protect the rule of law, protect fundamental rights with no political preferences. So I'm going to list a few facts, not opinions, of what occurred in Brazil, according to all pundits, everyone that has watched and commented what happened in Brazil. First, and very dangerous for democracy in Latin America, the politicization of the armed forces, with the appointment of thousands of active duty military personnel to exercise public offices. So there was the capturing of the armed forces, and the reference to the armed forces is my armed forces, not the people's, not the government, not the state, my armed forces. Second, a repeated glorification of the military dictatorship, which was even worse, with tributes to individuals that were recognized as torturers during the military dictatorship. Third, direct attacks on the Supreme Court and personal insults to their justices, direct attacks on the press and insults against journalists, attempts to discredit the totally reliable electronic voting system. And here, for someone that's not Brazilian and not familiar with what goes on in Brazil, Brazil has historically, since the beginning of the Republic, a tradition of electoral fraud. In 1996, we were able to eliminate fraud in elections by creating a system of electronic ballots, electronic voting machines that have a source code that's open 1 year before the elections for everyone to verify. Everyone meaning all the political parties, the federal police, the public ministry, which is an important institution in Brazil. You don't have it here in the United States, but it's kind of a amplified district attorney office, national office, and international observers. The source code is open to everyone, and then it's sealed, and it never goes online, and it's fed into the electronic machines through pen drives. There's no chance of fraud. And what happened was a major attempt from the previous regime to go back to paper ballot, which always meant in Brazil going back to a fraudulent system. And now we know that if we're dealing with people that were capable to invade the Supreme Court, Congress, and the presidential palace, just imagine what they could do in the voting stations where they thought they could lose. So this was a very important battle that we fought to preserve the traditional, it became traditional in Brazil, system of electronic voting machines. There were requests for impeachment of a Supreme Court justice, the non-concession after the elections, the incentives to supporters that thousands of people camped in front of the military barracks claiming for a coup d'etat, claiming for the disrespect for the result of the elections. Then we had these invasions of the headquarters of the three branches of government in January 8th of 2023. And now it's under investigation, but apparently with strong evidence, the articulation of a coup d'etat after the defeat in the elections. Again, I'm just reporting facts. I'm not issuing any opinion. Supreme Court played a major role during these 4 years in the pandemic, in protecting the environment, in protecting indigenous communities, and in voiding measures that the court deemed authoritarian. We launched criminal investigations. That was atypical, but it was decisive. The court launched investigations against far-right groups that were articulating coup d'etat by incentivizing the discredit of the institutions. And we've been handing down severe judgments against the invaders of Congress, the presidential palace, and the Supreme Court. Before I close, to understand the role of the Brazilian Supreme Court, it's important to understand that the Brazilian Supreme Court plays a role that is to a certain extent distinct than the role played by Supreme Courts and constitutional courts in most parts of the world. And there are a few reasons for that. First one, the Brazilian Constitution is a very comprehensive constitution that deals with many issues that in other parts of the world are left to politics. So the Brazilian Constitution, as any other democratic constitution, it addresses separation of powers, it has a Bill of Rights, and it organizes the state. Brazil is a federal state. But besides that, the Brazilian Constitution also addresses the social security system, the taxation system, the educational system, the public healthcare system, the way the budget should be structured, the role of the government in economic affairs, the protection of the environment, the protection of the indigenous communities, the protection of the elderly, the protection of adolescents, and you name it. The Brazilian Constitution, due to circumstances of the political process that generated it after the dictatorship, it deals with many issues that in this country and in other countries would be deemed political. So we decide cases that other courts would never decide. But the Brazilian Constitution says a balanced environment is a fundamental right. And the government has a duty to protect it. And these are the actions it must take. And then you have a list of actions. So maybe in this country, in certain cases, or in England or in other places, if someone would file a lawsuit claiming action regarding climate change, in many cases, the judge would say, this is a matter for politicians, not for the court. Not in Brazil, where some actions are clearly stated in the Constitution. And this is true for education, and this is true for healthcare and many other areas. So the border between law and politics in Brazil, it's harder to draw, and it's not totally clear in many issues, for good and for bad. Second, just like the United States, you can reach the court through a case or controversy, which is the basic requirement here in the US. However, in Brazil, you can also reach the Supreme Court through direct actions, challenging a statute on its face or challenging a public policy that is not satisfactorily complying with Constitution principles. So in Brazil, you can bring just about any issue that is in the Constitution to the Supreme Court. And then comes the third reason for this distinct role, is the number of actors that have standing to file direct actions, which includes the president, the attorney general, all governors, the Senate, the House of Representatives, all state legislatures, all political parties that are represented in Congress, which is over 20, and the National Bar Association, and national class entities, and national unions. So over 100 entities or actors have, we call it legitimacy, have standing to file direct actions before the Supreme Court. That means that any issue of modest importance reaches the court at a certain point in time. So I made a short list here of issues that we have decided, all of them quite controversial. Same-sex unions, LGBT rights, affirmative action for people of African descent, deforestation of the Amazon, abortion, drug policy, attacks on democracy, social media regulation, health measures during the pandemic, outsourcing and other labor relations issues. The Brazilian Supreme Court decides just about every issue of some importance, some relevance in the Brazilian system. That means we are always displeasing some important segment of society. If you decide in favor of taxpayers, the government is very upset. If you decide in favor of the government, taxpayers are upset. If you decide in favor of indigenous communities, the agribusiness people are upset, and vice versa. It's a no-win situation in our lives. If you are Supreme Court Justice in Brazil, you better have a very good analyst, a very good psychoanalyst, because the level of rejection is very high. And the truth is, I'll give you a true example. And I was the rapporteur here, and we ordered the removal of invaders of an indigenous reserve, an indigenous land that was demarcated, and there was illegal mining in that area, which is forbidden by law. There were 1,000 indigenous in the area and over 5,000 invaders, and we removed them. But if you have a survey in the region, we're gonna lose 5-1. So you don't measure the importance of a court of justice with polls, with surveys, because of course the proper interpretation of the Constitution, the right thing to do, quite often is not the most popular solution, and we need to live with it. So and the former president, he wasn't reelected, but he had 49% of the vote. And his basic discourse is, the court is my enemy. The court doesn't let me govern. They represent the elite. They are not aligned with the will of the people. And of course, there is many people that has this perception. If you ask, what was the decision that did not allow him to govern? They won't be able to say. But this is the discourse. And besides those 49%, they're the people that are displeased with other decisions that we take. So a court that has the prominence that the Brazilian Supreme Court has, of course, has to cope with a lot of opposition, with a lot of criticism. And that's part of life and part of democracy. There are many proposals of amendments in Congress to curb the powers of the court, and that's permanent debate. Congress is the place to debate things, but we have been trying to resist these changes because I think the Brazilian Supreme Court has served well the country. Of course, I don't agree with everything. In fighting crime and corruption, I voted, my opinion was dissident opinion in many cases, but generally in the advancement of fundamental rights for women, for gay people, for Afro-Brazilians, for people with disabilities, and protecting indigenous communities, the court has served very well the country. And what happened in Brazil, and it's very important to stress that, is we have a progressive constitution in a country, maybe I should say in a world that became more conservative. So we are interpreting a progressive constitution in a conservative society. And of course, this generates some sort of tension and some sort of criticism, part of life in a democracy. I want to end my presentation. I even wrote down this afternoon 3 conclusions. I'm going to finish with it. First, courts alone are not capable of resisting authoritarian populism. The participation of civil society, the press, and at least part of the political class is essential. In Brazil, at the decisive moment, the armed forces did not embark on the authoritarian adventures either. That's very important to say. Second, it's only 3. Democracy is currently experiencing a period of discredit in different parts of the world. It is necessary to make severe diagnosis to identify the reasons for this fact. Many people no longer identify with the values that have brought us here: substantive freedom, equal opportunities, and dignity for all. Furthermore, many others have not truly benefited from these values. So identifying all the problems with authoritarian populism, but we must have in mind that democracy has not fulfilled the promises it has made. And finally, the world is facing a time of darkness, with more might and less rights, more arrogance and less justice. These will be times of resistance and effort to keep the lights on. History is not linear. It's made up of advances and setbacks. But our role as citizens, as workers, as intellectuals, is to push history in the right direction. And the right direction is that of good, justice, and inclusion of all people. So it may be. Thank you very much.
This full force, really, and also thank you especially for ending on a note of inclusion that is really badly needed. So we were originally scheduled to end at 6, and obviously, you should feel free to leave if that's what you've been banking on. Let's go until 6:15 just to get a few questions in. And I'm going to turn over to the audience right away, so I'm not going to ask a question myself for that reason. I just want to say your devotion to the number 3 is very charming and entirely new to me, so I've not heard you being so devoted to any number, let alone that particular one before. So with that said, floor is open. And again, even if I know you or will not call you by name, if you want to introduce yourself, that would be appreciated, but since we're still recording, you don't have to.
Thank you. My name is Diego. I'm an MCMA student here. Chief Justice Barroso, thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and your thoughts. I've demonstrated that Brazil has had resilience over the last few years through the legislative, the Inquiry Commission that investigated the January 8th attacks, through the executive, through the federal police, and through the judiciary as well, not only in the coup attempt, but also between 2018 and 2022, through all the backsliding that we experienced in Brazil. My question is, Brazil has demonstrated resilience so far, but do the events abroad, internationally, face a kind of spillover effect in Brazil? Is Brazil prepared for international interference? Has Brazil learned with all this backsliding? And how prepared are the Brazilian institutions to face possible international interferences?
Well, one cannot deny that anything that happens in the United States has an impact over other countries, it has a global impact. But I don't think there will be any direct interference or influence. I've lived through a dictatorship that was supported by the US and we survived. So, but it's a matter of not abdicating your principles because the tide changed.
In front, Emma's coming.
My name is Nancy Berger, and I'm a former retired judge of the U.S. District Court in Massachusetts and a dear friend of Roberto's. There's an irony to you. I want to say that I have 3 comments, but I actually don't. There's an irony to your comments, and if I might be American-centric for a moment, you talk about how in Poland the Constitutional Court was captured by changing the retirement age and expanding the courts. The irony here is those 2 things have been proposed by the progressive left to deal with U.S. Supreme Court. In other words, the capture of the court came about not through changes in the retirement age, not through changes in the size of the court, but essentially capturing the vehicle for recruitment of judges. It's the counter to that that says, now that we have a 6-3 conservative majority, we want to expand the court and we want to introduce a retirement age. So those tactics have a different resonance depending on the underlying institutional structure. So I only had 1 point, not 3.
I'm curious about 2 other ones. Nancy, and happy to see you here. This is we have this meeting at Yale every year of constitutional judges from different parts of the world, and they invite very few professors and very few judges who are not Supreme Court judges, and Nancy was one of them, just to give you a flavor of the prestige she has. So I totally agree. You don't change institutions and you don't change your values because the circumstances are unfavorable. I was a few years ago, three years maybe, I was invited to a debate and was very happy with Professor Tribe, Michael Sandel, and a professor from Columbia, that had proposed that the Supreme Court was ripped of the power of judicial review over federal legislation. That was one of the discussions. There was a committee that was discussing this. And during my participation, I said, you need to be aware of the risks of changing institutions for circumstantial reasons. And most of all, the impact that this will have all over the world for populist leaders. So I think in times of darkness, of course, we try to keep the lights on, but we don't change values. We still, if we think that judicial value and independent courts are an important thing, we need to be resilient when they're not doing what we want, what we like, because this is part of life and this is part of democracy. So I would not support any change that would sacrifice principles for the convenience of the moment. I totally agree with what is implicit in your question. Although what happened in states, this cleavage here, who's progressive, who's conservative, who's Republican, who's Democrat, and people voting, aligning to partisan, it's not a good image for justice. And the perception that a court of justice is just one more political actor is not good for justice. In life, earlier with the students, of course, there are different visions of the world. But in life, not everything is political. There's right and there's wrong. And we should not sacrifice right for a immediate political benefit. And one thing, Nancy, that I think is below the radar, but I think that did harm to the perception of the court was what happened when President Obama appointed a justice and Congress never deliberated with months. And then within weeks, when it happened in the Republican government, they quickly approved, meaning they were not moved by principle, they were moved by politics. And that doesn't do good to the idea of justice that we all harness.
Get one more question. Over to you there earlier. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Gonçalo Costa, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Carr-Ryan Center. Thank you for the presentation. From what I got from your presentation, you see, in some sense, the judicial system is under threat from the rise of the right-wing populism and authoritarianism. But looking at the history in Brazil, and the recent history, it seems that the judiciary system was in itself permeable to this rise from within. And I'm thinking about the rise of Sergio Moro and the persecution of President Lula. And so, well, I'd like you, if possible, if you could speak a little about how the system in itself can be permeable to this to the rise of the far right and authoritarianism and so on, and how to prevent that, and if it's even possible to indeed keep a judicial system that is purely technical. And the second question is, well, I'd like you to comment on the changes that are happening in Mexico about the idea of bringing democracy to the appointment of judges. From what I understand, it seems that you think that that's not the way to go, because it hinders the power to protect the system from majorities. But I understand is also that Sweden also has this sort of like lay judges system, and we don't look at Sweden as the really authoritarian regime. So I don't know, well, just a few ideas that I wanted to throw on the table. Thank you anyway for the presentation.
Thank you. Well, I won't have time to give you a full assessment of my vision of the car wash operation
How about 3 sentences?
and what it did right and what it did wrong. It was a corrupt way of doing business and politics in Brazil that was reviewed by car wash operation, and that's true. And there were abuses and mistakes, that's also true. But it happens anywhere. Judges rendering wrong decisions, or I don't think that contaminates the system itself. Although the fact that the judge that convicted Lula afterwards accepted a position as Minister of Justice in the government, against whom Lula could not run because of his decision, of course, that was a problem for justice. And that's why the Supreme Court voided the decision, because the majority deemed that there was a political motivation. But corruption did exist, and I think the car wash operation helped reveal this way of doing politics and business, and I think things that used to happen won't happen again because of the operation. So there were pros and cons, in my view. Mexico. My crystal ball is kind of blurred, and it has a problem. It only sees the past. But looking at the past, what they did in Mexico is Supreme Court justices now are going to be elected. Judges are going to be elected. That goes against a basic tenet of constitutional theory. That is, the judiciary is not majoritarian. The judiciary interprets the Constitution, protects the rule of the law, and protects fundamental rights, even if it's the case against the will of the majority. That's why we say it's a counter-majoritarian power, famous expression by an American jurist. The counter-majoritarian difficulty. Judges are not elected, but they protect values that should not depend on the majority. So once you turn the judiciary into a majoritarian institution, there's no institution to limit power, because it's going to be a part of the majoritarian power. It's going to be one more political actor. That's not a good role for the judiciary. So I think it was a bad decision. Let's see how it plays out. But I would totally make a bad forecast for what's going to happen in.
So it's been really remarkable in recent years to watch the role of the Brazilian Supreme Court in Brazilian society by comparison with the role of the American Supreme Court in American society. So thank you for giving us such a comprehensive update on that situation. So please join me in thanking Roberto for